right. So I'm Rebekah Pite, and I've been thinking a lot about Ross Gay's Book of Delights as I've been attending this conference. If you don't know it, I highly encourage you to check it out. Every day he writes a different delight that he experiences, and I would say this whole conference has been a delight, and I feel so honored to get to come back and to participate and to learn from all my co-panelists as well as everyone that's in this room. So thank you so much. In 2006, which was my final year of graduate school, I enjoyed the wonderful opportunity that several of you have referenced to take part in a workshop that was going to help us improve our CVs and our letters of application for academic jobs. I got a lot of useful advice in this workshop, and I have no doubt that it helped me be a more competitive candidate and ultimately to gain a job. I'm currently an associate professor at Lafayette College, which is a liberal arts college in eastern Pennsylvania. And that is all something that I'm still so grateful for. At the same time as I thought about coming to this workshop, I kept going back to this one moment where I had shared my draft CV. And on it, I listed 3 different jobs that I had had between my undergraduate education at another liberal arts college and the time when I started my PhD in history and women's studies at Michigan in 2000. And the professor who was convening this workshop told me, take it off. And I was kind of stunned, and I said, why? And she said, well, it's not relevant. And so I think back in 2006, it's not to say that she was unenlightened, but I think that was more the ethos of the day when we were here, right? If it wasn't strictly academic, then it wasn't important. I kept it on anyway. That tells you a little bit about me. But one of the main points I want to make is even though I ended up following a relatively traditional career path in the academy to a liberal arts college, that this experience beforehand and in between my education has been critical to the things I study, the ways I teach, the ways I mentor. Further, now having served on 5 different search committees at my liberal arts college, I would say that from the vantage point of those of us who are seeking really excellent assistant professors to come into our departments, we not only, sorry, I was going to make it a too complicated negative phrase. We embrace this sort of career diversity. It is appealing to us. We want people to sort of digital humanities skills Tamar referenced, or who have worked in some other sector and are able to translate that for our students. And I recall myself when I was an undergrad going to talk to my professors and them telling me they really didn't know how they could advise me on what I wanted to do, which I had no idea what that was at that point, and that I better look elsewhere for advice. And so now I feel like I can offer that sort of mentoring to my students as well, and that feels really important. So my first main point is really that these experiences you're accruing no matter which path you follow, whether it be within the academy or outside of it, are going to be considered valuable at many kinds of institutions, including liberal arts colleges. My second main point is one I scribbled on this sheet after attending these really stimulating workshops, and that is, as a historian of Latin America, I don't often think of myself as a public-facing scholar. In fact, when I got this invitation, I thought, did they make a mistake? Am I really to be on this panel? And then the more I've been listening and thinking about it, I realized I do public-facing scholarship, but it's in Latin America. It's not in a US context. So I work on and study 20th century Argentine history. I focus on histories of everyday life. My first 2 books are on the story of their most famous culinary celebrity, whose name is Doña Petrona C. de Randulfo. I tell people that here, and I have to give a really long explanation that makes it seem important and relevant to them. And, oh, is she like Julia Child? Oh, well, yeah, she's like Julia Child and Betty Crocker and Martha Stewart and the Joy of Cooking. And you have to, so I have to do all this. There I say, study Doña Petrona, and people go, oh, really? Why? Well, that's so interesting. How did you figure that out? So a lot of my publicly facing scholarship has been in Argentina. And I think that's an interesting point maybe for the Q&A and for some discussion. For those of us who work on contexts outside of the US, how do we think about public history? Because I myself didn't necessarily even think about it until I got the chance to sit here and listen to all of you. So when I applied to graduate school, I likewise was really concerned about being very honest about what I wanted to study, as well as very unsure about how that would play, right? So I hope that these professional experiences that I had would be an asset, but I worried that it would be seen as kind of somebody who was not serious about academic inquiry because I spent 5 years doing something else. And furthermore, as somebody who really wanted to study food, I had worked for 3 years, my last 3 years before I came here were working in a public relations firm in food and nutrition consulting. So I was really passionate about studying food history, but I worried that that too would not be considered academic enough, serious enough, right? I now understand all the really deep and problematic reasons why food history was sidelined for so long because of its association with women, because of its association with the body instead of the brain, and I could go on, right? But I was so fortunate that when I came here, I had advisors who not only didn't try to dissuade me from this topic, but actually embraced it. So both Suzanne Caulfield and Rebekah Scott were really enthusiastic about my project, as were all the other professors I had the privilege of taking classes with. And as somebody in women and gender studies, I also got to do a lot of interdisciplinary training and also worked really closely with an anthropologist, Gillian Feely-Harnick, who I believe is now retired, but who was delightful, and I still cherish those memories of sitting in her office and talking about food studies as a field. So I feel like Michigan is an amazing place, and I think that the interdisciplinary conversations and possibilities that we have, and that we even had back then, are such a unique kind of asset for a large research university. The next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was when I went on the job market. And one of the main points I have to make to you all today is that it's really important to do your homework on the types of institutions you're applying to, especially in the ever more competitive kind of job field. So I think at the time I applied to something like 14 or 15 jobs. And I ended up, fortunately, getting interviews at the AHA for 4 very different types of institutions. One was a research university, which was very legible to my advisors here and to me from having been here. Another was the liberal arts college where I ended up, Lafayette. And another was a commuter college for largely first-generation students of color outside of New York City. And another was a community, kind of regional community college in central Pennsylvania. So they were wildly different, and I had to prepare for each of those interviews in very, very, very different ways and make a convincing case to each of them that I would be interested in working at their institution and that the skills I would bring from here were transferable, right? So now, having served on the other side of things and being on committees where we're looking for candidates to come to us, it really makes a difference if you get the institution you're applying to or not. And so that's something that I would really encourage you to consider. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'll come back to that. I also want to tell you a little bit about the kind of place that I ended up. Right? So Lafayette is a liberal arts college. It's in eastern Pennsylvania. Like Tamar, I teach a 3-2 load. But it's also a college that has tremendous resources. Like our library has every database, and we have all kinds of privileges in that sort of way. I am the only Latin American historian. I have been for the past 12 years. So I think one of the things that was really key to me getting hired there was the ability to convey what I was researching in particular was interesting and important to others who studied wildly different contexts, as well as the students in the room. Because at a liberal arts college, the students in the room are undergraduates. And I needed to be able to tell them why my research was important, as well as telling future faculty colleagues that I kind of had the chops to have an intellectual discussion with them that was going to be rewarding for them, even if they knew nothing about Argentina, or if they knew a lot, right? So pitching that kind of job talk can be really, really tricky. Where our tenure guidelines, I also thought it would just be useful to give you a sense of how it works out, are not that wildly dissimilar from a research university. And this is a point where where the college distinctions are different. So it was very clear to me when I was growing up that if I had a book manuscript and maybe a couple articles, I would be in a strong position, right? I was part of a committee that actually shifted the guidelines, kind of in step with what we've been talking about here, to say there are many different ways of contributing in a scholarly manner. And in fact, one of my former colleagues who got tenure, but kind of in this very tense case, had produced an amazing digital archive of visual materials that was publicly facing. And people were really nervous about that. And so a lot of the guidance I got was, don't do something like that. Do a book, it'll be safer, right? But nonetheless, I was part of this committee, we reshaped our tenure guidelines, but I want to be honest and say it's still trickier to go that way because it's not necessarily a norm across the academy. And so when you go up for tenure, you get external reviewers, as I brought this up in the question the other day, and they're going to often be assessing it in more traditional ways, even if your institution is more more progressive. Nonetheless, I think that the other point I wanted to make about kind of when I was my own journey through tenure is that when I went up, I did in fact have a book, and I had a couple articles, and I felt pretty good about that. But after tenure, you get this moment where you really have more of a choice, and arguably we should have more of a choice before tenure too, and that's one of the reasons we're here. But post-tenure, there really is this, and this was addressed in one of the panels yesterday, this moment where you get to pick what you do next. And for me, what I did next was take the book that I had just written and entirely rewrite it, basically, for an Argentine audience. Because I felt like here I've spent all these years and all this time writing this book that I know there's a number of people in the US Academy who study Latin American history will engage with, but it doesn't make sense to me to not write it for the people who care so much and for the people who I've spent all these years interviewing and meeting in archives and libraries and so forth. So I really spent a lot of the next several years essentially rewriting that book for an Argentine public and doing it in a way that was going to be accessible not only for members of the Academy, but the broad public. And so one of the things that was so delightful about that, and one of the things I did think about before coming to this conference, is in a way that felt like my moment of publicly facing scholarship. I had the tremendous delight of getting interviewed on television, on the radio, seeing my book in bookstore windows, and they have an amazing love of books in Buenos Aires and across much of Argentina. And that, for me, as a scholar who had wanted to make this broader impact, but studies a region that is a 10-hour plane ride from here, just felt like such a gift. I was so honored to get to share my research and also to get to talk with people about it who really cared, who their own lives had been impacted. They would say, oh, I have Doña Petrona in my kitchen cabinet, or I never liked her. She was always making all these fancy meals or yelling at her assistant, And that kind of stuff is like, why do I do this? I mean, I do this because I'm really interested in thinking about the humanity of people in Latin America and telling different kinds of stories about them, not just the stories that we typically hear. Right, so my next project is working on yerba mate, which is an indigenous infusion that the Guarani discovered and created, and then that is still consumed today in a very communal and ritualistic fashion. And again, the kind of intent is the same. Part of the point I'm trying to make is when we study the southern cone or the southern part of South America, we often think about dictatorship. But what if instead we're thinking about the ways in which people connect with one another, right? A tradition like this. And I'm not trying to be Pollyanna, right? One of my arguments is even within what they call the most democratic of traditions, which is how mate is described, there are still inequalities, right? So I'm not saying it's all perfect, but it's also not that this region only shares a history of dictatorship. All right, finally, my advice. In terms of what I wish I had known in graduate school in regards to my own institutional context. Again, one of my biggest points for the future folks who are going to apply to academic institutions is to really try to get a sense of what they are. And one of my kind of tips is to look at the teaching load and also to look at the faculty in the department you would be working on and their kind of involvements and commitments and levels of publication, and then to pitch yourself accordingly. So when we get job applications at Lafayette that just tell us about people's teaching and not about their research, we feel slightly offended, to be honest, right? We're kind of like, we're serious scholars too, and in our department of 11 people, you're the main people we're interacting with. We do workshops, we give each other feedback on their, So don't, one of the pieces of advice I got here was, if you're applying to a teaching college, lead with your teaching, and you don't need to even say very much about your research. That's not always true. However, for the kind of regional school that was a 4-4, when I went and interviewed with them at HA, they said, and I had one encyclopedia article and one forthcoming journal article. They said, what you've done from a research perspective is already enough for tenure. Everything else is going to be about your teaching and about your service, right? So it's really important to kind of understand the differences between institutions. Point 2, if you're offered an on-campus interview, ask who's going to be in the room and how they want you to pitch the talk. Right? At Lafayette, as I mentioned before, it's undergraduate students and faculty, and we want the candidate to speak to both, which is admittedly difficult. But knowing that ahead of time is a lot better than showing up in the room and saying, oh my gosh, there's students here. Number 3, in any college or liberal arts setting, you'll need to teach broadly. I teach Latin American history from the 1400s up to today. I designed a methodology course that's now a requirement in the history department. I get to teach really cool courses that are starting to do some of the more publicly facing scholarship with my students. For example, I teach a class that's called Global Stimulants, Histories of Coffee, Tea, Chocolate, and Yerba Mate. And the final project is they're using the Meta platform to create a digital exhibit with historical sources related to one of these and some interest of their own, right? So that's super fun about being at a liberal arts college, is nobody's saying to me, you have to teach this. They're just, as long as you're teaching about Latin America most of the time, that's great. I'm almost done. Number 4 is apply to teach your own class while you're at Michigan, if at all possible. I cannot stress this enough. When we're interviewing candidates now, one of the fine distinctions that, and this should not only be advice to the graduate students in the room, but also to the faculty and the department as a whole. I remember I applied in my final year here to teach my own course, and that made a world of difference and probably led to my landing of the job. When we interview candidates and they haven't taught their own course, and we have other candidates that have, that is often a distinguishing factor, right? So that makes a huge amount of difference if you can do that. My last 3 points are about after you land your first academic job, if that's the desire you want to go in, and if that ends up working out for you. And some of this is a little repetitive. As Manaya was saying, and this doesn't only apply if you do land such a job, but no matter where you are, this has been stressed throughout. But if you do, actively develop a network of scholars that extends beyond your graduate school advisors. I have been surprised by the extent to which I need letters of recommendation for grants and job applications and other things from folks who are outside of the people I already knew, right? So really seeking out scholars and at all stages and at different sorts of institutions is important. And if you are in kind of an adjunct or a visitor position, or you don't have the funds from your institution to go to big, international or national conferences, go to your local conference, right? Or seek out some kind of local, like Tamar was describing, group of writers. Be a curious colleague. We have a new colleague we just hired last year in the department, and she walked into, we have a little lunchroom one day, and she said, can you tell me about what you did to write your books and how you talk to publishers and when one should do that? And I just thought, that is so smart. I was so afraid to ask questions like that at first because I didn't want to appear ignorant. But actually, right, it was just such a wise thing to do. She had a couple people with different experiences, and it didn't have to be a big formal meeting, so don't be afraid to ask. If you are a visitor or an adjunct, ask the faculty to come watch you teach so they can write about your teaching when you're applying to other jobs somewhere else. That's also really, really important, and it might not occur to them necessarily. My next point is to know how to say no diplomatically. This is the same thing as kind of setting boundaries. When I first arrived at Lafayette, it was very clear to me that my life could be completely overtaken by service. Everybody wants somebody who is going to show up and do good work and not cause a big problem, right? And so if you're that sort of person, you're just gonna keep getting asked back. If you're a woman, you're a person of color, you're both, you're some kind of underrepresented category, even more so, right? And so in my case, the department head was able to serve as kind of a protection for me to tell certain people, no, you can't ask her to do that. She's pre-tenure, you've gotta, kind of leave her alone a bit. Sometimes I said no myself, but diplomatically, right? That's important. You want to be a team player. There's certain things that you really want to commit to because they're meaningful to you, because you kind of have to in some sense, right? But there are other things that aren't particularly meaningful to you and you don't have to do, and it's okay to say no to those. In fact, it's important because we're not people that just have, capacity that never stops. Doing something means you can't do something else. And so really prioritizing the things that are most important to you, I think, is a good thing to keep in mind. Finally, I just want to come back to that point I made at the beginning of the talk, which is to value and translate the value of your extra academic experiences to potential employers. We just had a discussion at lunch today with the folks I was sitting with about some experience that the person was saying, I don't know whether or not I should include this on my CV or a letter. And my advice is include it and tell us why it matters and tell us why it's important to you and tell us how it's going to help you mentor or teach or pursue a new line of research. Because we care and we want to hear that, but we don't necessarily know all the reasons in which it will. So as I mentioned at the beginning, today I talk to my students all the time who are undergrads, almost all of whom are not going to go into academia, about the different things I did as I didn't know what I was going to do, and I feel like it helps them in this moment in which they're often in the same place. And I'm delighted to know that the history department here is taking this message so seriously at the graduate level. So thank you again for inviting me to participate in the conversation.